Welcome to the post-Super Tuesday universe. I'm Thersites the Historian, and I'd like to provide some analysis of what went down on Super Tuesday, and more importantly, what we can expect moving forward. So the narrative is basically that Biden won a smashing victory and that it's all but over. The only thing missing is a chorus of fat women. I think that this narrative is somewhat misleading, and of course it comes from biased sources who want to see Biden win. And it's not just the mainstream media which is guilty of doing this. I watched a video by Tim Pool earlier where he was using what happened on Super Tuesday as evidence that his ideology, corporate centrism, is inherently correct and popular, and that progressive values are fringe because Super Tuesday. Of course, that is taken badly out of context, and there are a lot of reasons why Biden was able to get the result that he got. So first of all, let us not sugarcoat it. Biden won pretty handily on Super Tuesday. He has a slight delegate lead now, but I think that he's more vulnerable than people would like to imagine, at least the centrist people who seem to be the official opinion makers of the world. But let's begin at the beginning, as it were, and look at Super Tuesday itself in terms of why Biden was able to have so much success. Factor number one, Biden didn't get savaged in the debates for the last 2 weeks prior to Super Tuesday. This is actually key, and it's something that I definitely dropped the ball on in my debate analyses. I thought that Biden had been largely written off based on the poll numbers, and since he didn't really do anything in those debates, I assumed that this meant that people wouldn't really remember what he did. Well, I was actually right, because apparently people forgot that he had fucked up a lot. Even in those debates where he didn't say much, he still stumbled, fumbled, and mumbled the whole way. He also had a number of major gaffes when it came to interacting with people at rallies, such as recently referring to the young woman at a rally as a lying dog-faced pony soldier, which is some sort of really obscure movie reference that no one under the age of 70 would get. Anyhow, so he's had these things going on, but people seem to have forgotten it because the main narrative in the Nevada debate was the debut and destruction of Michael Bloomberg, and then in South Carolina it was just Pete yelling over people and Bernie being under attack the whole time in one of the most incoherent debates possible. However, one thing that I missed about the South Carolina debate is that Biden didn't really get that contentious in that debate. He stood back a bit. Perhaps because he was a bit dazed and confused about where he was, but nonetheless. For people who haven't been paying enough attention to realize that some of Biden's behavior could easily be attributed to dementia, well, they think he was being statesmanlike and reserved, above the fray. So if anything, by not doing anything at the South Carolina debate, Biden helped himself immeasurably. Most people thought that it was a shameful display. This was a pretty common opinion, especially among the kinds of Democrats who are open to voting for someone like a Joe Biden. That's factor number one. Factor number two is that South Carolina was played up as the greatest electoral success in the history of man, and it was made into much more than it actually was. Now, Biden won by a very healthy margin, and one that was much greater than the projections had predicted. That being said, South Carolina is something of an anomaly politically. Deep South has all kinds of issues that don't apply to other parts of the country. People are extremely deferential to elites, so when Jim Clyburn came out and endorsed Biden, a lot of people fell in line immediately. The Deep South is also extremely racially divided, and for older black people who tend to dominate primaries in the Deep South, their number one priority is always name recognition. They basically vote for name brand politicians because they're afraid of taking a risk on someone who's an unknown quantity. So because Biden is known to them from his 8 years as Obama's VP, he is a safe choice. Many of them might have considered voting for someone else, but after the failure of people like Pete and Amy to take off, and then the collapse of Bloomberg, and the clear unviability of Steyer outside of South Carolina where he was trying to become emperor, well, you have to go to somebody. They went to Joe. This shouldn't have been that huge of a deal. It probably should have given Biden some boost in Super Tuesday, but not of the magnitude we saw. The thing that gave him the boost was the media narrative afterwards. that basically Biden is the only person who can win black votes. There are a lot of very soft-headed white liberals in the country who buy into narratives that try to guilt them about voting for someone who they prefer, but black people may not prefer. I know a lot of people who would be swayed by that argument and cave on all of their principles without a second's hesitation in order to try to please an unknown 78-year-old black person living in the middle of South Carolina. Of course, as I've pointed out in the past, including in my recent discussion with Sean Chick, the Deep South and the Democratic voters in the Deep South are completely irrelevant in a general election. So trying to cater to the preferences of voters in the Deep South for the Democratic Party is a terrible idea unless they have significant evidence that this would help them win in either Georgia, Florida, or both, in which case it would be a different discussion. But if you're trying to cater to people in South Carolina or Alabama, states you will never win, this is terrible strategy. 3. Bloomberg collapsed in the debates. This is something that really helped Biden out significantly. When Bloomberg was dividing the moderate lane, this meant that it was hard for Biden to really hang on to a lot of his support. Bloomberg also prevented people like Pete and Amy from having a chance at making a surge. If Bloomberg had not been in the race, Pete most likely would have made a surge, and it would be a Bernie-Buttigieg race. But that was not possible because Bloomberg literally bought out all of the support that Pete earned on the campaign trail and ensured that whatever Pete did in the first 4 states wouldn't matter a bit. I don't feel bad for Pete, of course, but that is what happened. He basically got screwed by Bloomberg. And then when Bloomberg in turn collapsed in the debates, this left that moderate vote back up for grabs. And make no mistake about it, Bloomberg's vote, unlike every other candidate's vote, is very conservative. This is the right wing of the Democratic Party. There's no question about that. The only people who support Bloomberg are either rich, they are extreme about anti-gun positions, and that's their only issue, so they're one-issue voters, which doesn't necessarily make them on the right of the Democratic Party, so I guess I misspoke a little bit earlier. Just let's add that clarification now. Or they are people who fundamentally think the Democrats should run to the right and try to mimic Trump to defeat him. So these are the only people who vote for Bloomberg are people who are rather conservative-minded. It would go to the next most conservative candidate, in this case with Klobuchar gone, that is clearly Joe Biden. And even with Klobuchar in, I think it would still probably be Biden, although some of them would go to the Klob, and then a few of them would go to Peter the Cheater probably. And fourth, the one that everybody knows about, Pete and Amy dropped out all at once. They cashed in, sold out, whatever the case may have been, and they did so within 24 hours of each other. The establishment got together all of the possible establishment Democrats. They all dropped out to endorse Biden except for Bloomberg, who waited till after Super Tuesday. So Biden just got this surge where he has this media narrative. He has basically everybody in the party switching their stance on him. People like Beto went from talking about how Biden was unviable or represented the past to talking about how great he was. So Beto got off his skateboard, left the park, made a little speech somewhere in Texas, and then went back to skating. So that's what happened. So there's this feeling around Biden that he had the momentum. There was a huge bandwagon effect that was in place. And I think that this is a more accurate description of what actually happened than the sort of Tim Pool centrist hack bullshit narrative about how progressives are just this little chunk of the electorate who are just crazy people on the fringe and no one shares their values and everybody came home to Pop-Up Joe. No, this was a manufactured event that was choreographed to favor the establishment favorite. A piece of good news about what happened, believe it or not, there is a piece of good news here. If you think about the possible options the establishment has to generate buzz for one of their candidates, they basically used almost all of them on Super Tuesday. They have very few cards left to play. There are still 2 big cards they may have, which may indeed prove fatal in the end, for Bernie, I mean, but I think they've played the majority of their hand at this point. So if Bernie can manage to bounce back from this huge setback, he probably, at that point, will be in a good position. I don't want to try to draw up odds, but I will say Bernie definitely can win even after what happened on Super Tuesday. It's a setback to be sure, but that is no reason to quit fighting if you're a progressive. So that leads us to what now? Again, Bernie can still pull it out. Here are the stakes. Now, another false narrative I hear, even from Bernie people, but especially from people who are not supporting Bernie, is that the stakes consist of whether or not Donald Trump gets a second term. And of course, we believe in policies, so there are some policies that won't be implemented, but we'll have to wait 4 years. Those are the stakes that people lay out. What they don't seem to understand is that 2020 is a census year. If Joe Biden is nominated, he will then go on to get his ass kicked by Donald Trump in historic fashion. Because you have to factor in how he will run his campaign and how people will react to a candidate who is literally falling apart at the seams on the campaign trail. Right now, we're in an era where people do not vote a mixed ticket. Unlike in, say, the 50s or 60s, you can't nominate someone who gets their ass kicked and still hold in the Congress. If someone gets nominated who gets beaten badly, you lose governor's mansions, you lose races for state legislatures, you lose a lot of things that have nothing to do with the presidential race. So keep that in mind. Point 2 is that this is a census year. A census year means that the results of this year will heavily impact how districts are drawn up going forward. So for all of the subsequent elections from 2022, 2024, 2026, 2028, and up to 2030, the results, or the way that the map is drawn up, will depend heavily on the outcome of this year's election. This means that if the Republicans just absolutely clean up, as they definitely would if Joe Biden was nominated, this means we lose the entire decade. The whole decade is off the table. Any progressive change would basically have to wait until either a complete economic meltdown, which would cause Democrats to be able to win in red districts, or until 2030, 2032, somewhere in that range. So the stakes are actually a lot higher than people seem to realize. I just want to correct this misunderstanding now. Also, of course, there's a Supreme Court. Some people would argue you'd have to vote for whoever the nominee is, blue no matter who, because of that Ruth Bader Ginsburg seat. But I am not on board with that for reasons I'll get into later. That being said, if the court is lost and Trump gets to basically appoint half the court, you can guarantee he's going to promote the biggest right-wing hacks he can possibly find, and it will be messy trying to get anything done because anything that's remotely progressive will be found unconstitutional. So, here's the new path to victory for Bernie Sanders. It is not nearly as good as the previous path, yet it is still quite plausible. One, and this is something that Bernie is already doing, he must attack Biden's record. And he must attack it relentlessly. He needs to emphasize that there are massive degrees of difference between himself and Joe Biden. In terms of their policies, their values, etc. Their records, all of that. He needs to make sure that people understand that it is a very stark choice. He cannot go after Joe personally, though, because that tends to backfire. His surrogates need to start making dementia hints, however. He needs to let Nina Turner or someone like that go out and make those kind of attacks. Maybe Bill de Blasio, who's basically an attack dog. Marianne Williamson's too nice to do something like that. If Tulsi Gabbard ends up dropping out and endorsing Bernie, she might be the perfect person for the job. Or if she manages to get onto the debate stage by winning that one delegate in American Samoa, then maybe then she can do the hatchet job, pull out the white pantsuit and go in and do what she does. So that will be key. And Bernie, I think at this point we can count on him to probably do this. Hopefully he will stop saying Joe is my friend, and he'll say, look, Joe Biden, here are the problems with the man. Here's why you shouldn't vote for him. Here are the differences between me and him. There's a big difference between me and Trump, difference between Joe and Trump. Who the hell knows? Point number 2. Biden will be exposed to much more scrutiny. This one is also more or less guaranteed to happen. Now that there are fewer candidates, you can't really justify talking about Mayor Pete or Bloomberg and his record spending. You have to talk about the people still in the race. This means that if you show footage from a Biden rally and he's stumbling and fumbling and he can't remember the name of God, or he can't remember where he's at or what office he's running for, all of these things will be noticed. If he gets unnecessarily and unreasonably angry with people for no reason, which, by the way, that kind of irritability is a sign of dementia, then this will be noticed. People will take note. And as we've seen, since this electorate is much older than had been anticipated before, a lot of the people in the electorate, while they favor more moderate shit, they will know the signs of dementia because they will probably be people whose parents or uncles and aunts have had it within the last 20 years or so. And this will be something that they're very keen to look for. So once they see that this is the case, maybe it will cause them to have to bail on Joe. So if there's a head-to-head duel, Bernie versus Trump, not Trump, excuse me, Biden, all of the previous polls, which showed Bernie versus all the people in a head-to-head, show that Bernie is actually preferred among Democratic voters. This was a poll made in response to the claim that if you add up the moderates into Megazord, that they would beat Bernie, but then that poll basically disproved that notion. But now the Democrats are trying it anyway, but they gave Biden a huge boost with the Super Tuesday thing and this whole orchestrated victory party for him. The huge X factor at play now that Bloomberg is gone too, without a doubt, is Elizabeth Warren. Warren literally right now potentially holds the fate of the entire decade in her hands. I'm not exaggerating. That is true. If Warren were to stay in the race and try to push for a brokered convention as she said she will, or at least as she said she will prior to coming in third in Massachusetts, then pretty much here's what will happen. Biden will win a plurality, or Bernie will only very narrowly win a plurality. The nomination will go to Biden or someone else. That person will then get absolutely owned like a slave by Donald Trump. And then the party will be out of power for 10 years, guaranteed. Now, maybe they managed to win back a few things here and there because of some sort of backlash to Trump, but there's not really much possibility for any major progressive change for the rest of the decade if 2020 is lost by massive margins. So, I will show you now how Warren already cost Bernie on Super Tuesday. I'll start out with the states Bernie won, because remember, every delegate counts because Bernie absolutely has to win a majority to get the nomination. There's very little way for him to win without an outright majority because the entire party apparatus is arrayed against him. Let's start out in Vermont, where he won by a very healthy margin. He had 51, Biden had about 22, Warren had 13. Bernie gets 11 of the 16 delegates, Biden got 5. If you added most of Warren's voters, I assume about a little over half would go to Bernie. Then in that case, Bernie probably gets maybe 12 or 13 delegates. I know I'm, working with small change here, but again, every delegate matters. California, Bernie will get most of the delegates because he got most of the vote. That being said, he is splitting a lot with Biden. Bernie only won 34-25 and then Warren at 12. So far, of the 415 delegates, not all have been allotted, but Warren already has 9 of them. She'll probably end up with around 20 when all is said and done and everything has been allotted. If, say, half or more of her voters had gone to Bernie, that might have actually produced more than, say, 20 delegates because Bernie would then be over 40% of the total vote in California. So that would have been pretty important. Now, if we go to the states that Bernie lost clearly, where Warren would not have been able to put him over the top, you see a similar thing. It would have also very much blunted this narrative that Bernie got blown the fuck out. Let's look at Virginia. It was 53-23, Warren at 11. 99 delegates at stake. Let's say that Warren's 11%, 7% of those, let's say 7 out of the 11%, that doesn't work mathematically, but you know what I'm trying to say. 7 out of those 11 go to Bernie, he gets 30%. That's several delegates. And while 53 to 23 is an absolute blowout, 53 to 30 is only a regular blowout. Again, perception matters. And while it may sound like I'm looking at small numbers, it still matters. That 8 or however many delegate difference could end up being the whole shebang. In Texas, Biden won 34.5 to 30. Warren had 11.4%. There are 228 delegates at stake. Let's say that Warren's supporters had not even gone to Bernie enough to put him over the edge. I think that he would have won the state if not for Warren. But let's just assume he didn't for whatever reason. Maybe the Warren supporters were so butthurt about her departure that they didn't show up in sufficient numbers for Bernie to put over the top. Well, when you have a state that large, that's still a lot of delegates, just like when I was talking with California. Even a couple percentage might mean several delegates, maybe even a dozen or more. Let's look at, hell, Utah. Again, small state, only 29 delegates. Bernie took 35%, Biden took 17%, Warren took 15.5%. Let's say 8 of Warren's supporters went over to Bernie. Then he gets up to 42. That gives him 2 or 3 delegates. Massachusetts, no question. If Warren at 21% had endorsed Bernie at 27%, then Biden at 34% would not have won the state. Bernie would have been pushing probably 45% at that point. Maybe only 40. Let's just call it 40. And maybe Biden gets a little boost up to 37. So Bernie would win the state. Putting color on the map definitely affects perception. Maine. It was 34 Biden, 32 Bernie, about 16 Warren. There's no question if Warren were not in the race, Bernie would have won Maine and won it by a comfortable margin. Minnesota, 39 Biden, 30 Bernie, 15 Warren. Well, again, I don't know for sure if this would have put Bernie over the top, but I think it probably would have. Maybe, say, 41-39, 40-39, something along those lines. Or maybe they end up tying at around 40 or 41. But again, these are just estimates I'm kind of making up. The point of it is that a lot of delegates who would have otherwise gone to Bernie were wasted on Elizabeth Warren. She's not going to be able to do anything with those delegates other than fuck Bernie Sanders. Now, in theory, both Warren and her supporters all support progressive policies. When I see the Warren supporters on Twitter, they talk about how they support this plethora of progressive initiatives. All they're doing by continuing to support Warren is ensuring that those things will not happen for at least another decade. There's no other way to look at it. That's where things stand right now. So, Warren dropping out is an absolute necessity for Bernie getting nominated at this juncture. If Bernie has any chance at all, it only comes through Elizabeth Warren stepping the fuck down. So if we combine Warren stepping down with Biden's brain doing what it does in front of the public, I think at that point Bernie has a pretty good chance of winning a convincing plurality, going in with momentum, or possibly even just barely squeaking a majority by the narrowest of margins. Of course, this doesn't make me super confident, but if there's a chance, we should still fight. The other X factor, the one card the establishment has left, potentially 1.5 cards depending on how they play it, is Obama. Obama so far has not formally endorsed anyone, and it is not really customary for a former president to endorse in a primary. However, if things were really close, I could imagine Obama doing something like that. The problem is if Warren is in the race or not. So let's say that if Warren's in the race and Obama knows that Biden is clearly failing, so he endorses Warren to take away votes from Bernie. That would be fatal, absolutely. Let's say that Obama is pressured into endorsing Biden when he's really failing, and it becomes clear that Obama's only objective is to stop Bernie. Now, given the loyalty that a lot of Democrats feel toward Obama, this misplaced loyalty for a president who betrayed progressive objectives, and also betrayed the working class in every way imaginable, that still might be enough to kill Bernie right then and there. Now, it also killed the party, so I don't know if Obama would actually be willing to do it. But that is why it is so imperative that Warren get the hell out of the race. I think it's safe to say that Biden will falter and falter badly, and Obama does not want to put his name on Joe Biden in the unlikely event that Joe Biden was to somehow win the presidency, because a Biden presidency would be a complete train wreck. A president with full-blown dementia is unthinkable. And another thing, if it ends up that Biden wins the whole thing, there is going to be a whole lot of pressure on people to endorse the Democratic nominee. I will not be doing that unless the Democratic nominee is Bernie Sanders. I'm a leftist, not a Democrat. That's an important distinction. Biden is very much closer to Trump when it comes to both ideology, his values, and his policies than Bernie is to Biden. There is more difference between Biden and Bernie than between Biden and Trump. And I'm not a centrist, I'm not a moderate. I will never again vote for one. In 2016, I was deeply divided going to the polls as to whether I would cast my ballot for Jill Stein or for Hillary Clinton. I hate Hillary Clinton, as most of you know. But because I live in Ohio, I thought maybe Hillary might have a snowball's chance in hell at winning the state, and that might make the difference. Because I knew that Trump would be a terrible president, and, well, not surprisingly, I was right. So I voted for Hillary at the last second. I went in mostly leaning Jill Stein, voted for Hillary last second. I regret that vote. I wish I could get it back. It still haunts me to this day. I will never again vote for anyone who runs under the label of centrist, moderate, or someone who proudly proclaims their allegiance to capitalism. Never, ever, ever again. Under any circumstances. No exceptions. If Biden does win the nomination in the end, then I absolutely hope he does win with a plurality. Because then the Democratic Party would have actually acted according to something like a democratic principle. If he wins fewer votes than Bernie and gets the nomination, then that is a violation of democratic principles, small d sense. And in that case, I think the party should die. Either way, if Bernie is not nominated, I'm out. I'm done. Another quick note, I probably should have put this earlier, but there's also a difference between candidate preference among voters and policy preference among voters. So again, to circle back to Tim Pool, centrist hack idiot, who said that Super Tuesday shows that people don't want progressive values. Over 50% of Democrats in the exit poll said they wanted Medicare for all. Most of them indicated that they preferred progressive policy outcomes. And this is an old electorate which showed up on Super Tuesday. You can only imagine when the full electorate is in play what they think. The problem is that voters are not very informed. Voters often do not know who stands for what, or that you have to vote for a candidate who stands for something for that candidate to hopefully try to fight to make that thing happen. Voters sometimes lack basic logic. So, that is basically all I have to say about all of this. It's a little disorganized, but hopefully this answered any questions that some of you may have about what I think about Super Tuesday. I'm sure I'll be doing more of these videos, especially when we get to next week. I believe there is another primary in Michigan, also one in Idaho, but who cares? And there will be a debate, I believe, the week after next. So, until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Remember, this race is not over yet.